Hey everyone, tonight we're sailing into a story of near victory and quiet defeat. France came closer than you might think to winning the American war against Britain, and history could have turned out very differently. Before we drift into that world of foggy seas and flickering candlelight, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy these calm journeys through history. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let's gently begin tonight's story together. After the drums of the 7 Years' War had gone silent, France found itself surrounded by the quiet sound of loss. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763, was a document of humiliation, written in neat diplomatic ink, but heavy with the weight of failure. The French flag no longer fluttered over Canada. The Caribbean sugar islands that had survived the war were scarred. In India, the East India Company ruled where French influence had once dreamed of empire. And across the Channel, Britain celebrated with parades and the calm arrogance of victory. France, by contrast, entered a strange silence. The court of Louis XV was restless but weary. Versailles glittered, as it always did, but beneath the gold leaf and marble floors, there lingered a sense of something lost. Ministers whispered about finances, about colonies, about pride. France still possessed beauty, art, and culture, but empire, it seemed, belonged now to Britain. The sea, once shared, had become an English lake. If you walked the halls of Versailles in those years, you might have heard the faint echo of regret in the corridors. Portraits of generals who had failed were quietly moved. Courtiers avoided mentioning Canada. And yet, deep in the offices of the Navy and the Foreign Ministry, a few men refused to forget. They studied Britain's rise carefully, noting every weakness, its debts, its colonies, its fragile trade routes. They began to wonder, what if the empire that seemed so powerful could someday be undone not by armies, but by distance, exhaustion, and rebellion? Across the Channel, Britain had begun to stretch itself thin. Its colonies in America were flourishing, but also restless. Taxes were raised to pay for Britain's massive war debts. The Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts, and the endless quarrels over taxation without representation. All of this reached France through letters, reports, and gossip among diplomats. In coffee houses of Paris, merchants and philosophers discussed the American colonies as if they were a new kind of political experiment, people loyal to a distant king, but increasingly aware of their own power. For the French, still licking the wounds of 1763, this was a curious sight. Some saw it as poetic justice. Britain's victory in the 7 Years. War had come at a cost that might now be paid in rebellion. Others were skeptical. The English are quarrelsome, one French diplomat remarked, but they will never truly divide. Their merchants will always find a way to make peace with their king. Yet, as the 1770s approached, that confidence began to fade. In 1770, Louis XV's death brought a new monarch, young, uncertain, and idealistic. Louis XVI was only 20 when he inherited the throne, more interested in locks, astronomy, and small mechanical curiosities than in the subtleties of foreign policy. But around him gathered men who remembered the old humiliation vividly. Among them was Charles Gravier, the Comte de Vergennes, a quiet, deliberate diplomat who had spent years observing British politics. To him, Britain's empire seemed less invincible than it appeared. They have conquered more than they can hold, he noted, and in time, their colonies will become their burden. But for now, France could do little. Its navy was weak, its finances stretched, its people taxed and tired. The Treasury Minister, Turgot, begged for restraint. No new wars, he warned. No grand adventures. Let us repair what is broken first. But Versailles was not a place built on patience. Beneath the calm surface of court life, masked balls, operas and promenades, was a simmering sense of unfinished business. In the salons of Paris, where intellectuals gathered beneath painted ceilings and candlelit chandeliers, the talk was of liberty, reason, and the rights of man. Voltaire's wit still echoed through conversation. Rousseau's writings on freedom circulated in secret. When word arrived that the American colonies were resisting British taxes, many in France read it not as rebellion, but as philosophy brought to life. The Americans, they thought, were putting Enlightenment ideas into practice. The news arrived slowly, carried by ships that took weeks to cross the Atlantic. Letters from London described protests, boycotts, and pamphlets. French newspapers reported the Boston Massacre of 1770 in quiet detail. 5 dead, but the symbolism far greater. Some at court smiled at the irony. Britain, which had once mocked France's revolutions and riots, now faced its own unrest. Still, few in France imagined the colonies would truly break away. Wars of independence were rare in the 18th century, and the idea of 13 colonies defying one of the world's great powers seemed absurd. And yet, something about the American quarrel felt different. It was slow, deliberate, and philosophical. It was not a sudden uprising, but a steady erosion of loyalty. Meanwhile, in France, bureaucrats and naval planners began the long, quiet work of recovery. Shipyards in Brest and Toulon rebuilt slowly, guided by new designs and new methods of navigation. Naval officers studied British tactics, learning from past defeats. New academies were established, and a generation of young officers, many of them too young to remember the shame of 1763, grew up with a quiet hunger to restore France's honor at sea. They were taught patience, discipline, and mathematics. They learned the geometry of gunfire, the art of wind, and the dull rhythm of maintenance. Every rope, every plank, every nail mattered. It was a kind of national therapy, a way to heal from defeat, not with glory, but with precision. And slowly, France changed. By the mid-1770s, Paris had become a place where old grief met new curiosity. The economy was fragile but improving. The court was still extravagant, but the government was learning the quiet science of restraint. Louis XVI, though cautious, allowed his ministers some freedom. And so, when news reached Versailles that in America, the colonies had begun to gather militias and declare defiance, there was more than curiosity. There was opportunity. The French Foreign Ministry began to collect information obsessively. Who were these rebels? What weapons did they have? How organized were they? Spies in London reported that British politicians were divided. The colonies were costly to control, and there was talk in Parliament of compromise. But King George III, stubborn and proud, refused to yield. In the marble halls of Versailles, Vergennes read the dispatches carefully. He saw in the chaos a familiar pattern. Britain, overstretched and confident, was about to repeat France's own mistakes. The minister wrote in his report, "They will try to hold America by force, and in so doing, they will lose it." Still, France could not act openly. The wounds of the last war were not yet healed. To move against Britain again would invite ruin, unless it could be done quietly and with purpose. So for now, France watched. In 1774, Benjamin Franklin arrived in London as a colonial representative. A scientist, a philosopher, and a statesman, he became a quiet celebrity even among the French elite. His experiments with electricity were admired, his essays translated. But when his political troubles deepened and his allegiance shifted toward the American cause, he became something more, a symbol of the New World's calm defiance. France watched him closely. In the salons of Paris, Franklin was imagined as the living embodiment of Enlightenment virtue, simple, wise, and serene. He represented something the French found deeply fascinating, a civilization without kings, without nobility, guided by common sense and reason. It was a fantasy, of course, but one that appealed to a nation tired of its own gilded cages. By 1775, the war in America had begun. The battles of Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, and the Siege of Boston were distant thunder across the ocean. The British Empire was at war with itself. The French court, officially neutral, pretended disinterest. But in secret, the ministers met late into the night. Reports from spies and merchants described British ships burning stores, soldiers retreating, and American militias forming under strange new flags. Louis XV listened carefully. He was young, uncertain, but aware that this might be the chance his grandfather had lost. England, he is said to have remarked quietly, is not invincible. And so, the planning began. Not for war, not yet, but for the possibility of it. Maps of the Atlantic were unrolled on polished tables. Accountants tallied what resources remained. Admirals reviewed which ships could sail within a year, which needed repair, and which were beyond saving. France was not ready, but it was beginning to imagine itself so. And somewhere, deep beneath the routines of court life, there stirred a faint excitement, a whisper that perhaps history could be rewritten. Perhaps the humiliation of 1763 could be erased, not through pride, but through patience. But for all the quiet ambition, one question lingered in every discussion, unspoken but inescapable. Could a wounded empire truly afford another war, especially one fought across an ocean? In the winter salons of Paris, conversation moved like candlelight, slow, wandering, and full of speculation. There were whispers of rebellion across the Atlantic, rumors of a people declaring independence from a king. At first, no one quite believed it. Colonies were meant to obey, not proclaim their own destinies. And yet, as reports from London arrived, the impossible seemed to be taking shape. The American colonies had written something extraordinary, a declaration. The Declaration of Independence, read aloud in Philadelphia that July, reached France weeks later in a translated form. Its words, simple and confident, spread through drawing rooms and universities like sparks carried by the wind. All men are created equal, it said. Governments derive their powers from the consent of the governed. These were not royal decrees or laws born of centuries of tradition. They were, to the French mind, philosophy in motion. In the polished salons of the Hôtel de Crillon and the Hôtel de Soubise, noblemen and thinkers debated over glasses of wine whether such an idea could truly survive in practice. The aristocrats found it naive, the intellectuals found it exhilarating. For years, France had been a nation of thinkers trapped under etiquette and ceremony. Now, from across the ocean, came news of a society daring to live as if philosophy could replace monarchy. The French government, of course, pretended indifference. Louis XVI was cautious, bound by his treasury's limits and his youth's uncertainty. But his foreign minister, Charles Gravier de Vergennes, watched events with calm calculation. He saw opportunity in the chaos. Britain, distracted by colonial revolt, might finally be vulnerable. Still, he knew France could not act rashly. War was not yet possible, only preparation. So, the French began to gather information. In 1776, Vergennes ordered quiet intelligence reports from London, Amsterdam, and the American coast. Merchants were instructed to observe British fleets, to count the ships at Portsmouth and Plymouth, to note the movement of regiments. At the same time, diplomats in London were told to listen, to dinner conversations, to Parliament gossip, to the uncertain tone of British officials who no longer spoke with the confidence of empire. Across the Channel, Britain was restless. The war against the colonies was proving more complicated than expected. Armies could occupy towns, but not loyalty, and every victory on the battlefield seemed to create another rebellion in the countryside. The French ambassadors in London wrote home about the mood of exhaustion. They win battles, one wrote, but they lose hearts. Vergennes understood the pattern. It was the same rhythm that had broken France 2 decades earlier: overconfidence, debt, and distance. Britain's vast empire, so glorious in peace, was a burden in war. Meanwhile, in the small, crowded streets of Paris, merchants and printers began to profit quietly from the distant conflict. Maps of America sold briskly. Pamphlets describing the geography of the colonies, the nature of their people, and the progress of their armies circulated among the curious. To many ordinary Parisians, America was still a distant dream, a place of forests, rivers, and endless fields, untamed and idealized. But to others, It was something more profound, a chance for France to undo the humiliation of the past. In January 1777, the British captured New York. It was a major victory, and for a moment, it seemed the rebellion might end quickly. But the Americans were resilient. They fought not for conquest, but for endurance. They melted into forests, rebuilt after defeats, and fought again. For the French observers, this persistence was both strange and admirable. It was around this time that Benjamin Franklin arrived in France. He came not as a general or diplomat in the traditional sense, but as something far more unusual, a philosopher with a mission. Dressed plainly, often in a fur cap rather than a powdered wig, Franklin seemed to embody the quiet dignity of the New World. When he arrived in Paris in December 1776, he was received not by kings at first, but by thinkers, scientists, and admirers of his writings on electricity and reason. Franklin moved through Paris with a calm that fascinated everyone he met. He spoke softly, listened more than he talked, and smiled when others expected grand speeches. To the French, he represented everything their own world was not: simplicity, virtue, and freedom from pretense. He became, almost overnight, a symbol, an Enlightenment saint in spectacles and homespun cloth. In reality, Franklin's mission was delicate. He had been sent to secure French support for the American cause: money, weapons, and perhaps eventually, an alliance. But he knew France's wounds still ran deep. He began with patience. Through intermediaries, Franklin met with Vergennes. Their conversations were quiet, deliberate, and cautious. The French minister listened, weighed, and asked questions about logistics rather than ideals. How many men could the Americans arm? How stable was their government? How unified were their leaders? He knew that sympathy was not strategy. Still, Vergennes was intrigued. Here was an opportunity to weaken Britain without directly confronting her, at least not yet. If France could secretly support the American rebels, Britain would bleed slowly across the ocean, spending its strength where France had once spent hers. By early 1777, the first secret shipments of aid were being organized. France could not send soldiers openly, but it could send money, weapons, and supplies, disguised as private trade. A front company was created, Rodrigue Hortales and Comwell. Officially, it was a Spanish trading firm, but in truth, it was funded by both France and Spain under the quiet direction of the playwright and businessman Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, the same man who would later write The Marriage of Figaro. Through his efforts, muskets, powder, and uniforms began to flow across the Atlantic. The operation was tedious, bureaucratic, and fraught with delay. Ships had to be disguised, manifests forged, and bribes paid. Everything depended on weather, luck, and secrecy. A single captured cargo could expose the entire operation. But somehow, it worked. Meanwhile, the mood in Versailles shifted. At first, the American rebellion had been an abstract curiosity. Now, it was becoming a matter of state. Ministers began to discuss the possibility, still distant, of formal intervention. But Turgot, the finance minister, warned again. We cannot afford another war. The ocean is wide, and the cost of revenge is infinite. His caution was not wrong. France's debts were already heavy. The population was weary of taxes, and famine flickered at the edges of the countryside. Yet others argued that pride, not profit, should guide the nation. If England loses her colonies, one advisor said, she will lose her soul. And so, France hesitated, but not idly. Its navy continued to rebuild quietly. Dockyards rang with the sound of hammers. New ships were laid down, old ones repaired. Young officers studied charts of the American coast, learning names like Boston, Charleston, and Chesapeake Bay. The education was not theoretical, it was preparation. Franklin, ever patient, continued his quiet diplomacy. He hosted dinners where French philosophers and courtiers mingled, speaking of liberty and the progress of mankind. He made himself approachable, never demanding. Time and good example, he said, will do what argument cannot. By late 1777, France's sympathy for the American cause had become something deeper: hope. Reports arrived from America describing a major British defeat at Saratoga. General Burgoyne's army had surrendered, an event so improbable that when the first news reached Versailles, many refused to believe it. But confirmation soon followed. For Vergennes, it was the proof he had waited for. The Americans were not merely dreamers, they were capable of victory. If France acted carefully, it might finally tip the balance against Britain. The question, however, remained: when? To act too soon would be ruinous. To wait too long might let Britain recover. In the delicate rhythm of diplomacy, timing was everything. For now, France would continue to aid the rebels in secret, gathering strength quietly behind the facade of peace. But beneath that calm, something irreversible had begun. The idea of revenge, once whispered in frustration, was now being discussed openly in polished halls. France, humiliated in 1763, was beginning to believe it might rise again. And as Franklin lit his candles in the cold winter evenings of Passy, surrounded by curious French admirers and silent dispatches from America, one thought flickered constantly in his mind. Would the old world truly risk itself to save the new? In the early months of 1777, the French government moved like a cautious animal, alert, deliberate, and unwilling to expose itself too soon. Officially, France remained neutral. The king had issued no declarations, no public promises. But beneath that polished restraint, the machinery of secret war was already turning. The Hôtel du Ministère des Affaires étrangères, tucked away behind the facades of Versailles, became the quiet heart of a deception that would span oceans. The doors were kept closed, the curtains drawn, and the discussions spoken in low voices. Vergennes, France's foreign minister, had convinced the king that covert aid to the American colonies could be given without declaring war. It would be a careful balance: too much help, and Britain would discover the truth; too little, and the rebellion would die. And so, a company was created. On paper, it was a trading house, Rodrigue Hotales & Co., supposedly managed by a group of wealthy merchants interested in Caribbean and North American commerce. In reality, it was a ghost enterprise, built from the signatures of bureaucrats and the imagination of a playwright. Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, whose wit had already made him famous in Parisian theatres, now became the unlikely broker of revolution. He was charming, impulsive, and endlessly energetic, an idealist wrapped in the mind of a merchant. Through Hotales & Co., he arranged for muskets, gunpowder, cannon, and uniforms to be shipped to the Americans. The funds came quietly from the French treasury, disguised as loans. Spain, equally interested in seeing Britain humbled, contributed as well. But for all its daring, the operation was anything but glamorous. Each shipment had to be disguised as commercial cargo. Crates of gunpowder were labelled as flour. Cannon were listed as agricultural tools. The paperwork was endless: permits, shipping manifests, insurance documents, bribes to customs officials. The men involved lived under constant risk. One mistake could expose everything. In the port of Nantes, warehouses began to fill with contraband bound for America. Sailors, merchants, and dock workers worked long into the night, loading ships with false manifests. Some knew the truth. Others preferred not to ask. Ships left under neutral flags, their captains instructed to avoid British patrols at all costs. The Atlantic had become a quiet, dangerous highway for secrets, and the risks were enormous. The Royal Navy ruled the sea. Its ships prowled the coastlines of Europe, inspecting vessels and seizing cargoes suspected of aiding the rebels. French captains, though officially at peace, found themselves shadowed by British frigates. More than once, ships carrying grain from Nantes or Bordeaux were stopped and searched. Yet, through a combination of luck, weather, and clever paperwork, most of the shipments reached their destination. In America, the supplies that arrived from France were a lifeline. Powder from French arsenals armed the Continental Army at key battles. French cannon rolled into position on muddy fields. Many American soldiers never knew the origin of their weapons. But without them, the rebellion might have collapsed in its first years. Back in France, Beaumarchais' efforts turned chaotic. The bureaucracy of the Ancien Regime was a labyrinth, one where even secret operations required official receipts. Beaumarchais struggled to keep the books balanced, to explain why commercial losses were so large and why ships seemed to vanish. He wrote letter after letter to ministers, begging for more funds, promising that the Americans would repay the loans once independence was won. But repayment was not really the point. For Vergennes, this was not business, it was strategy. He watched Britain closely. Each intercepted letter, each merchant report from London told the same story. The war was costing more than expected. British merchants complained about disrupted trade. Taxes increased. Protests broke out in small towns. England begins to tire of her own strength, Vergennes wrote to the king. The ocean, which once served her, now divides her. Still, caution ruled every move. The king, Louis XVI, was deeply uneasy about secret warfare. He was not a gambler by nature. He had inherited debt, not fortune, and the shadow of France's earlier defeats still hung heavy in his mind. But Vergennes reassured him. This was not war, only preparation for a future that might demand it. Meanwhile, in Paris, Benjamin Franklin continued his quiet campaign of persuasion. He never pressed, never begged, but his presence was reminder enough. He lived modestly in Passy, avoiding ostentation. Visitors found him reading by candlelight, surrounded by letters from the colonies. "Patience, sir," he would say with a smile to any who asked about American independence. The tree of liberty grows slowly, but it bears fruit. To many Frenchmen, Franklin became almost mythical. Prints of his likeness were sold in markets. Medallions bearing his face were cast and distributed. Women wore Franklin caps, imitating his simple fur hat. He represented something France's aristocracy had lost, a sense of authenticity. In a society built on performance, Franklin's calm sincerity felt revolutionary. But diplomacy, like war, thrives on timing. In 1777, reports from America began to show signs of hope. The British Army, though victorious in New York, was struggling to suppress rebellion elsewhere. George Washington's forces endured defeats, but they continued to fight. In July, the Marquis de Lafayette, a young nobleman of only 19, secretly sailed from France to join the Americans. He did so without permission, defying both royal command and reason. His departure scandalized Versailles, but delighted Franklin. It also sent a message across the Atlantic. French hearts, if not yet French armies, were with America. For all the romanticism of Lafayette's gesture, the true work of support remained hidden in the ledgers and shipyards. By the summer of 1777, Hortales and Cohner had sent thousands of muskets, tons of powder, and uniforms for tens of thousands of men. It was not enough to win a war, but it was enough to keep one alive. Still, Britain suspected. The British ambassador in Paris, Lord Stormont, sent increasingly frustrated letters to London, accusing France of hypocrisy. He demanded to know why French ports tolerated traitorous trade. The French government denied everything. "We are merchants, not meddlers," Vergennes replied with diplomatic calm. Yet Stormont's letters grew sharper. "Every musket fired in rebellion bears your mark," he warned. To the British, the denials were an insult. To the French, they were an art form. Officially, France respected neutrality. Unofficially, it had become the rebellion's lifeline. As the year wore on, the network expanded. French merchants collaborated with Dutch and Spanish intermediaries, using neutral ports to disguise their shipments. Caribbean islands became staging points, where supplies could be quietly transferred to American ships. The Atlantic became a puzzle of deception, each piece fitting only for those who knew where to look. For the men who managed it, the work was exhausting. Letters took months to arrive. Ships disappeared in storms or were seized by privateers. Payments were delayed, and bureaucrats in Paris demanded explanations that could never be written honestly. Beaumarchais, overwhelmed by debt and frustration, wrote to Vergennes, "If France will not help openly, then at least do not leave me to drown in my own secrecy." Vergennes understood his exhaustion, but secrecy was the only way. Each month, he sent careful reports to the king, brief, measured, always underlining restraint. France, he wrote, must not act until it was clear the Americans could endure. If the colonies collapsed, France's involvement would be a scandal. But if they succeeded, the reward could be immense. Britain would lose her colonies, her prestige, and perhaps her naval dominance. And so, the months drifted on. Winter came again to Versailles, cold and quiet. In the royal palace, the great mirrors reflected candlelight and the hum of distant conversations. Few among the courtiers understood that France was already, in its own quiet way, at war. Ships still left the ports of Nantes and Bordeaux, their holds heavy with grain. Franklin continued his gentle diplomacy in Paris, smiling at suspicion and answering questions with parables. And Vergennes, patient and deliberate, waited for the one thing that would justify all this secrecy: proof that the Americans could win. That proof would come from a forest in New York in the autumn of 1777. It would arrive in letters written by soldiers who never imagined their victory would change the balance of empires. But for now, in the dim offices of Versailles, the ink dried slowly on secret orders, and the quiet men who signed them wondered just how long they could keep the truth hidden from Britain's watchful eyes. And yet, behind all the secrecy and deception, one question lingered like smoke in the ministers' chambers. How long can a secret war remain secret when the tide of history is already shifting? Autumn came early to the valleys of New York in 1777. The leaves along the Hudson River turned gold and rust red, falling silently into the mist that hung over the fields. To the north, near the small town of Saratoga, two armies faced one another, one battered and hungry, the other desperate and determined. For the British, this campaign had begun with confidence. General John Burgoyne, a man of theatre and charm as well as discipline, had led his army south from Canada that summer. His plan was elegant on paper: move down the Hudson Valley, join forces with other British troops advancing from New York City, and slice the rebellious colonies in two. New England, the cradle of rebellion, would be cut off from the rest. The war, he believed, would end by Christmas. But the American wilderness had its own plans. The roads were little more than muddy trails, choked with fallen trees and boggy marshland. Heavy wagons sank into the earth, horses collapsed from exhaustion, and every mile forward was shadowed by skirmishers, farmers, frontiersmen, and militiamen who melted into the forest after each shot. They cut bridges, poisoned wells, and set fires in the night. Burgoyne's redcoats advanced, but slowly, bleeding strength with every step. Supplies dwindled. Reinforcements never arrived. And far to the south, General Howe, commanding the main British force in New York, had chosen to move on Philadelphia instead of marching north to meet Burgoyne. What had been designed as a trap now became an isolated expedition, crawling deeper into enemy country without escape. The Americans, under the cautious leadership of General Horatio Gates and the restless spirit of Benedict Arnold, gathered in the woods near Saratoga. Their numbers grew daily. Farmers left their fields, blacksmiths their forges. It was not a professional army, but it was a determined one. Many had known only defeat and retreat in the war's first years. Now they were fighting on home ground, and that made all the difference. By September, the stage was set for a confrontation neither side had fully anticipated. On September 19th, Burgoyne's forces clashed with the Americans at a place called Freeman's Farm. The sound of musket fire rolled through the forests like thunder, echoing off the hills. Smoke drifted between the trees, blurring friend and foe alike. For hours, the battle surged back and forth. The British line held, but at a terrible cost. Burgoyne's men had taken the field, but not the victory. 3 weeks later, on October 7th, they met again at Bemis Heights. This time, the Americans struck first. Cannon fire shook the ground. Musket volleys flashed through the smoke. Benedict Arnold, though stripped of command by Gates after a quarrel, rode into the fray on his own accord, furious, fearless, shouting orders above the chaos. His leg was shattered by a musket ball, but his reckless courage broke the British line. When the smoke cleared, Burgoyne's army was trapped. Surrounded, starving, and cut off from retreat, he held out for a few days longer before accepting the inevitable. On October 17th, 1777, General Burgoyne surrendered his entire army to the Americans. Nearly 6,000 British soldiers laid down their arms on the fields near Saratoga. It was the first major victory of the Revolution, and its echoes carried far beyond the battlefield. In Paris, the news arrived in November. Couriers rode through the cold rain to deliver the sealed dispatches to Versailles. Vergennes read them in silence, his face calm, but his heart racing. The Americans had done what few in Europe thought possible. They had defeated a British army in open battle. For Vergennes, it was the proof he had been waiting for. The rebellion was not a passing riot. It was a war that could be won. At once, the atmosphere in Versailles changed. Ministers who had doubted now began to whisper of opportunity. Merchants spoke openly of American trade. Admirals studied maps of the Atlantic with renewed interest. Even King Louis XVI, usually hesitant and cautious, began to waver. If France joined the war now, it would not be risking everything for a lost cause. It would be striking a blow at a weakened rival. Benjamin Franklin, too, felt the shift. When word of Saratoga reached him, he was sitting in his modest home in Passy, surrounded by letters and the quiet hum of a Paris afternoon. Visitors recalled that he smiled when he read the news, but said nothing for a long time. At last, he folded the paper and murmured, "Now they will listen." And indeed they did. In December 1777, Vergennes invited Franklin and his fellow commissioners to secret meetings. The tone was no longer polite curiosity. It was urgency. France could no longer simply send weapons in the shadows. Britain's weakness had created an opening, and if France delayed too long, another power, perhaps Spain, might seize the chance first. The king hesitated still. War was costly, and France's treasury was already strained. The ministers argued deep into the night, their candlelight flickering on polished tables. One by one, they weighed the risk. To fight Britain again might bring ruin, or redemption. Vergennes pressed his case. "Sire," he said quietly, "this is not the moment to tremble. England stands alone. She bleeds from the very wound she inflicted upon us. If we act now, we may see her humbled at last." Louis listened, silent and pale. He had not sought glory, but the tide of events was pulling him toward it. The ministers waited, and then, at last, the king nodded. "Very well," he said. "Let us aid the Americans, openly." The decision, when written into royal decree, was brief and formal. But in the candlelit corridors of Versailles, its meaning was electric. France would recognize the United States of America as an independent nation. France would form an alliance, pledging troops, ships, and gold. Across the ocean, the weary American army shivered in its winter camp at Valley Forge, unaware of what had just been decided in a distant palace. But history had shifted. The fall of Saratoga had done more than win a battle. It had summoned an empire. Soon, French shipyards would hum with new purpose. Muskets would be forged, not for secrecy, but for war. And across the Atlantic, the red, white, and blue of two revolutions, the American and the French, were beginning to intertwine in the long shadows of fate. The storm that Britain had long feared was about to break. In February 1778, beneath the gilded ceilings of Versailles, two worlds met across a polished table. On one side sat the French, the Marquis de Vergennes, cautious but resolute, Gérard de Reneval, a sharp-eyed diplomat, and aides who whispered translations into one another's ears. On the other side, draped in plain cloth and calm dignity, sat the American delegation, Benjamin Franklin, Silas Deane, and Arthur Lee. Outside, the winter rain tapped softly on the palace windows. Inside, history shifted with the scratch of a quill. France and the newly declared United States of America signed two treaties that day, one of friendship and commerce, and one of alliance. The latter was sealed in strict secrecy, but the implications were enormous. France recognized American independence and promised military aid should Britain refuse peace. The agreement was more than politics. It was revenge written in diplomatic language. After 2 decades of humiliation since the 7 Years' War, France was finally stepping back onto the stage, not as a silent observer, but as an avenger. The news, once public, stunned Europe. Britain's isolation was complete. In London, ministers cursed Franklin's name and tore at their wigs in frustration. The king, George III, reportedly grew pale upon hearing the word alliance. An old rivalry, thought settled in 1763, had rekindled in full flame. For France, this meant immediate preparation. Shipyards along the Atlantic coast awoke from their long sleep. In Brest, Rochefort, and Toulon, thousands of workers began hammering planks, mending sails, and rolling cannon into position. Naval officers, some seasoned from colonial wars, others barely 20, were summoned back to duty. In Paris, Franklin became something between a celebrity and a saint. He walked the streets in his simple brown coat, a fur cap on his head, and a calm smile that enchanted a nation fascinated by the idea of liberty. Women in salons wore their hair à la Franklin, and portraits of the American sage hung beside those of philosophers and kings. But beneath the charm and ceremony, Franklin knew the reality. France's entrance into the war was not an act of idealism, it was a gamble. Its navy was still rebuilding, its finances fragile, its strategy uncertain. Yet, in the stillness of Versailles, Vergennes had wagered that striking now would finally wound Britain where it hurt most. Its empire and its pride. By the summer of 1778, fleets were ready to sail. The first French admiral to take command was Charles Hector, Comte d'Estaing, a man of ambition and restless energy. He led a powerful squadron across the Atlantic, 12 ships of the line, 4 frigates, and thousands of sailors. Their destination, the American coast. Their mission, to turn the rebellion into a global war. When the French fleet arrived in July, they were greeted with astonishment. For the first time in the conflict, the Americans had a European ally visible on the horizon. The plan, though hopeful, was complicated. D'Estaing was to coordinate with General Washington's forces to attack the British stronghold at Newport, Rhode Island. But coordination between land and sea was slow and uncertain. Signals lost, tides misunderstood, tempers short. At Newport, the combined operation faltered before it began. Storms scattered the fleet. The British slipped away, and after weeks of delay, the French withdrew to Boston for repairs. The Americans were disappointed, though not surprised. Their revolution had always depended on improvisation and patience. Washington, ever cautious, reminded his officers that alliances were new things, fragile and human. "Let us remember," he said quietly, "they have come far, and we must learn one another's ways." Meanwhile, the war widened. In the Caribbean, French and British ships began clashing among the Sugar Islands, Guadeloupe, Dominica, St. Lucia. Each island was a jewel in the imperial crown, and each battle, though fought thousands of miles from the American mainland, was part of the same conflict. The Caribbean air was thick with humidity and gunpowder. Naval battles were slow, grinding affairs, sails torn, hulls splintered, men collapsing from heat and smoke. Britain, once dominant at sea, suddenly faced a two-front struggle. Its fleets had to protect not only America, but India, Africa, and the Mediterranean. Everywhere, the Union Jack flew over waters now hunted by French ships. And yet, for all its promise, France's first year in the war was filled with hesitation. The alliance existed, yes, but the results were modest. No decisive victory came in 1778. The Americans endured another harsh winter, and the British still held New York and Philadelphia. But beneath the surface, a quiet transformation was underway. The mere presence of France had changed the balance. British generals could no longer move freely, fearing French fleets might appear on their flanks. American morale, once brittle, began to harden with hope. And in Versailles, Vergennes felt a slow satisfaction. Each report that crossed his desk, each British dispatch intercepted, each naval engagement, was a small repayment for 1763. Still, there were whispers of doubt. France had entered a long and costly war, and the American rebels were far from victory. The king worried about the treasury, about riots, about the unpredictable force of revolutionary ideals seeping through Europe's courts. But for now, those thoughts were distant, like thunder still far away. The French alliance had begun, and the world was no longer the same. Across the Atlantic, Franklin wrote home to Congress, "The king and his ministers appear fully resolved to go through with us. Their fleets are fitting out in all the ports, and the spirit of enmity to England is universal." The ink dried slowly on his letter, the handwriting uneven with age. He paused before sealing it, aware that what had started as secret aid had now become an open war, a war that could lift a nation or ruin an empire. In the harbours of France, as ships creaked in the tide and cannons gleamed in the lantern light, no one yet knew which it would be. By 1779, the American War of Independence had ceased to be a colonial rebellion. It had become something far larger, a global struggle for power that stretched from the sugar islands of the Caribbean to the icy waters off Newfoundland, from the shores of India to the fortresses of Gibraltar. France's entry into the war had unbalanced the old order. The British Empire, long used to fighting isolated enemies one at a time, now faced a coalition forming against it. For the first time in generations, the Royal Navy was stretched thin. And in Versailles, Charles Gravier, the Comte de Vergennes, watched with quiet satisfaction as the chessboard of empire began to tilt. But France was not alone in its designs. In April 1779, Spain, bound by family ties to France through the Bourbon kings, decided to join the war. Officially, it did not recognize American independence, wary of setting a precedent for its own colonies. Yet its goal was clear: to humble Britain, reclaim Gibraltar, and recover the territories lost in 1763. The combined weight of French and Spanish fleets was formidable. Over 120 ships of the line, one of the largest naval forces ever assembled. Their admirals dreamed of crossing the English Channel itself, of bringing war to Britain's own shores. In London, panic spread like a chill wind. Militia units drilled in the fields outside Portsmouth. The coasts were fortified. Rumours of invasion swept through taverns and newspapers. For a summer, it seemed possible that Britain might face on its own soil what it had long inflicted upon others. But the invasion never came. The weather turned foul. Coordination between the French and Spanish admirals broke down. Supplies dwindled, and disease spread through the crowded decks. The massive fleet, though impressive on paper, spent most of the season drifting between the Channel and the Bay of Biscay, an armada without direction. By autumn, it limped home to port, battered by storms and exhaustion. Still, the symbolic weight of that failed invasion was immense. Britain, once mistress of the seas, had been forced into defence. The empire was stretched to its limits, and the war, no longer confined to the American continent, was beginning to devour resources on every front. Far from Europe, battles erupted in quieter, stranger places. In the Caribbean, French and British warships clashed in dazzling bursts of cannon fire over tiny islands whose names few in Europe could pronounce: Grenada, St. Lucia, Martinique. Each of these islands, though small, was a prize of enormous value. Their sugar plantations fed economies, financed navies, and defined the wealth of nations. In July 1779, the French admiral d'Estaing captured Grenada after a fierce battle. His victory was a bright moment in a campaign otherwise plagued by delays. But for every island gained, another was threatened. British reinforcements moved swiftly through the Caribbean, fortifying what they could, abandoning what they could not. The tropical heat killed more men than musket fire. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the war touched the cold, northern waters of the Atlantic and the rocky coasts of Newfoundland. Privateers, some American, some French, harried British fishing fleets, seizing cargoes and spreading confusion. The war had become a web of distant engagements, each one small on its own, but together, draining the British treasury and fracturing its control of trade. And yet, even as France's reach expanded, its efforts in America faltered. The French army, still preparing to cross the ocean in full force, remained mostly in Europe. Supplies to Washington's army arrived irregularly. Promised funds often vanished into the complexities of war finance. Communication across the Atlantic could take months, and misunderstandings were common. In the summer of 1779, a curious episode unfolded off the coast of Britain itself. A Scottish-born American captain named John Paul Jones commanded a small fleet under the American flag. But his crew, his ships, and his funding were largely French. He sailed boldly into British waters, raiding ports and capturing merchant vessels. Then, on the night of September 23, 1779, off Flamborough Head, Jones encountered the British warship HMS Serapis. In the blackness, lit only by cannon fire and burning rigging, the two ships locked together, their masts scraping in the night wind. The battle was savage and close. When the British captain called out for Jones to surrender, Jones famously replied, "I have not yet begun to fight." Hours later, when the smoke cleared, the Serapis had surrendered. Jones's own ship, the Bonhomme Richard, a gift from France, was sinking beneath him. He transferred his flag to the captured British vessel and sailed away victorious. To the French public, the battle was thrilling. Franklin ensured the story was printed across Europe. It gave the Alliance a hero, a moment of daring in a war otherwise slow and bureaucratic. But even Jones's triumph could not disguise the truth. The war was proving far more costly and complicated than France had expected. At Versailles, ministers grew uneasy. Each victory demanded more gold, more ships, more lives. Taxation could not rise further without risking unrest. The Navy's expenses multiplied, and France's fragile economy began to creak under the weight. Still, Vergennes remained steadfast. "It is better," he said, "to suffer for the ruin of England than to live under her triumph." By 1780, that ruin seemed distant but imaginable. The British had been forced to defend at once in the Americas, the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, and India. Their trade routes were under siege. Their debts climbed. Their ministers quarrelled in Parliament over whether to continue the war or cut their losses. But wars of attrition rarely move quickly. For all France's gains, the Americans were still fighting on their own soil, their army thinly clothed and half-starved. The Alliance had promised salvation, but salvation was slow to arrive. In America, the winter of 1779-1780 was one of the harshest on record. The Hudson froze solid. Even the Delaware River turned to ice. Washington's army huddled in huts at Morristown, their breath freezing in the air. Supplies from France were delayed by storms. Men deserted, food ran short, and despair crept through the camp. And yet, in that bleakness, word arrived that the French were preparing a full expeditionary force, troops, ships, and gold, to finally fight beside the Americans, not just for them. It would take months to prepare and longer to sail, but the promise itself gave Washington's army something new to hold on to. By spring, the winds were shifting once again. The war that had begun as rebellion and grown into rivalry was now spreading into full-scale global conflict. And somewhere across the sea, in the bustling ports of France, thousands of men were boarding ships bound for a land they had never seen, fighting not only for a new nation, but for the chance to settle an old score. The question lingered in the air like the echo of a cannon shot across calm water. Would France's gamble end with Britain's fall, or with its own exhaustion? The summer of 1780 began quietly along the rocky coast of Rhode Island. The harbours were still, the air heavy with salt and the hum of insects. Fishermen watched from the shore as, one morning in July, the horizon slowly filled with sails, white against the blue, shimmering like a mirage. At first, they thought it might be another British squadron, but as the ships drew closer, the tricolours and fleur-de-lis became clear. The French had arrived, 41 ships in all, under the command of Admiral Charles-Henri d'Estaing's successor, the calm and deliberate Admiral Ternay. And on board, nearly 6,000 French soldiers led by a man who would come to be deeply trusted by George Washington, the Comte de Rochambeau. Their arrival was not sudden, nor was it smooth. The journey from Brest had taken months, with storms scattering the fleet and sickness creeping through the decks. But as the anchors dropped in Newport Harbor, the French presence in America, once a rumor, once a hope, became real. It was a moment of cautious celebration. The American people greeted the French warmly, but with reserve. For many, memories of old wars with France still lingered. In taverns and churches, some whispered that inviting another European power onto American soil might only replace one master with another. But George Washington saw further. He knew the war could not be won alone, and France's help, ships, men, and money, was the last chance to tip the scales. When Washington and Rochambeau first met in person, in the quiet town of Wethersfield, Connecticut, the tone was polite, but uncertain. Rochambeau was every bit the French nobleman, formal, courteous, used to command. Washington was calm, reserved, his words measured and slow. They spoke through interpreters at first, but over time, they learned to understand one another without them. Both men were soldiers of patience. Both understood discipline and fatigue. And both knew that this alliance would succeed only if they trusted one another completely. Rochambeau's army made camp near Newport, its tents lined with the precision of Versailles courtyards. Their uniforms, blue and white with gold trim, were immaculate. French engineers built fortifications, and the local townsfolk soon found themselves trading with the newcomers for wine, flour, and cloth. Yet, for all their readiness, the French could not move freely. The British Navy, still strong, blockaded the coast, making large operations impossible. Rochambeau's soldiers spent nearly a year in quiet waiting, drilling, training, repairing, and preparing for a moment that never seemed to come. It was, in a sense, the most boring but essential part of the war. Logistics. They counted musket balls, dried gunpowder, and mapped roads through New England's hills. They trained their horses to the sound of distant cannon fire. They waited for news, for orders, for the fleet that would one day free them from British control of the sea. The waiting was long enough that friendships began to grow between the French soldiers and the locals. Farmers learned bits of French. Soldiers picked up English curses and jokes. Newport became a strange mixture of languages and smells. French coffee mingling with American tobacco, the songs of Breton sailors blending with colonial hymns. One French officer, the young Marquis de Chastellux, wrote home, "The people here are plain and industrious. They look at us as if we were creatures from another world, and yet they treat us as friends. We share our bread, our wine, and our patience." Washington, meanwhile, faced a cruel reality. His army was starving again. Pay was months overdue. Men deserted by the dozens. In the South, the British had captured Charleston, taking thousands of American prisoners. And in the same season, the traitor Benedict Arnold had fled to the British, leaving a scar on the army's spirit. Even so, Washington remained steady. He wrote to Rochambeau often, their letters marked by mutual respect. In one, he confessed, "We are in want of everything, but we shall not despair, so long as our allies continue to act with the same firmness and friendship." Rochambeau did. He understood that, for all France's power, the heart of the war still beat in the worn tents of the Continental Army. Throughout 1780, their combined forces did little fighting, but they planned meticulously. Maps of Virginia, New York, and the Chesapeake lay spread across tables in candlelit meetings. They debated where to strike next. New York, heavily fortified, seemed too strong. The South, however, where Cornwallis's British army moved freely, offered possibilities. The problem, as always, was the sea. France's main naval force in the West Indies was under Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse, a cautious man with a strategist's patience. For months, Washington and Rochambeau sent letters urging him to sail north when the time came. But timing, in war, is never simple. Winds, supplies, and enemy fleets determined everything. So the French soldiers waited. They held concerts and dances to pass the evenings. Rochambeau's officers organized lessons for the American soldiers, how to march in formation, how to handle artillery, how to build fortifications properly. Washington's men watched with quiet admiration as the French moved with mechanical precision. And perhaps, in those quiet months of 1780, something changed between the two nations. Suspicion turned into trust, curiosity into camaraderie. When winter came, Rochambeau sent word to Paris. "We are ready. The Americans are steadfast. What we need now is the fleet." France answered. In early 1781, orders reached the Caribbean. Admiral de Grasse was to sail north to the Chesapeake Bay. His fleet would meet Washington and Rochambeau's combined forces in Virginia. The operation, if successful, could trap the British Army there and end the war. It was an enormous risk. De Grasse would have to evade the British Navy, cross hundreds of miles of open sea, and coordinate perfectly with troops he had never seen. But it was the kind of calculated risk France had waited years to take. In the spring of 1781, Rochambeau broke camp. The French army, its banners fluttering, began a long and quiet march through New England. Washington's troops marched beside them, barefoot, ragged, but proud. Villagers lined the roads to watch this strange alliance move through their towns. French drums beating softly beside American fifes, the two armies united in purpose, if not in comfort. They marched south toward destiny, not knowing exactly where it would lead. For most of them, the war had become a rhythm of waiting and walking, hoping and hungering. But that summer, for the first time, there was direction. The sea, once their enemy, was about to bring deliverance, and as they crossed the rivers and valleys of America together, both armies, one born from revolution, the other from monarchy, shared a single unspoken thought. If they could catch the British in Virginia, perhaps this long, grinding war could finally end. But that, as history would show, depended on the wind, the weather, and one French fleet still sailing through the Caribbean heat. The summer of 1781 dawned hot and uncertain. The war had dragged on for 6 long years, and both sides were exhausted. In the north, New York still held firm under British control. In the south, Lord Cornwallis and his seasoned troops were pressing through Virginia, burning supplies, scattering militias, and daring the Americans to stop them. Washington, camped on the Hudson, faced a familiar torment: inaction. His men were hungry, his treasury was empty, and the war seemed to have reached a dreadful equilibrium, a stalemate slowly draining life from both sides. But then, a letter arrived. It was from the Caribbean, written in the neat, formal hand of Admiral François de Grasse. The words were polite, but electrifying. He was coming north. De Grasse's fleet, 28 ships of the line, would sail to the Chesapeake Bay, bringing with it troops, supplies, and the promise of naval supremacy, if only for a fleeting moment. For Washington and Rochambeau, it was the break they had prayed for. If they could move quickly, if they could reach Virginia before the British Navy reacted, they might trap Cornwallis completely. The decision was bold. For months, Washington had dreamt of attacking New York, reclaiming the city that had haunted him since 1776. But he knew deep down it was impossible. The city was too well defended, the British too entrenched. Now, fate pointed south. And so, quietly, secretly, Washington and Rochambeau began the Great March. They spread rumors that they were preparing to attack New York, building fake camps, sending false messages, even constructing ovens to bake bread for imaginary soldiers. The British in Manhattan watched, puzzled, thinking the American army was gathering for another hopeless siege. But at night, the real columns began to move, one by one, slipping away through the woods and down dusty roads. It was August 19th, 1781. Washington led the Continental troops. Rochambeau commanded the French. Together, nearly 10,000 men began the long journey from New York to Virginia, a trek of more than 400 miles under a scorching sun. The soldiers trudged through New Jersey, crossed the Delaware River, and passed through Philadelphia, where citizens lined the streets to watch. To many, it was the first time they had seen the French army up close. The sight was astonishing. Disciplined ranks of soldiers in crisp blue coats, their drums rolling in perfect rhythm beside Washington's ragged but determined men. Children waved flags. Women handed out bread and water. Old men lifted their hats in silence. After years of despair, hope seemed to march with them. Still, the journey was hard. The roads were poor, wagons broke, and summer storms turned paths to rivers of mud. But Rochambeau's men were meticulous. They repaired bridges, kept order, and shared what food they had. Slowly, an unspoken bond grew between the two armies, born not of language, but of endurance. By early September, they reached the head of Chesapeake Bay. Washington, now 50 years old, rode at the front, his face weathered but resolute. He had spent most of his military life retreating. Now, for the first time, he was advancing toward the decisive battle. At Mount Vernon, his long-abandoned home, he stopped briefly for the first time in 6 years. Witnesses later said he stood silently on the veranda, looking out over the Potomac, before quietly rejoining his troops. There was no time for nostalgia. Meanwhile, fate was moving swiftly at sea. De Grasse had arrived at the Chesapeake with his full fleet, and not a moment too soon. His ships, gleaming in the late summer sun, filled the bay like floating fortresses. He immediately began unloading French troops under the Marquis de Saint-Simon to reinforce the Americans, while his sailors set up a naval blockade to trap Cornwallis from the sea. Then, as if drawn by history's design, the British Navy appeared on the horizon. Admiral Thomas Graves, commanding 19 ships, had sailed from New York to break the blockade. On September 5th, the two fleets clashed in what would become one of the most decisive and underappreciated battles of the entire war. The Battle of the Chesapeake. The sea was calm, the air thick with smoke. Cannons roared for hours as ships maneuvered and collided, masts splintering, decks catching fire. By day's end, both sides had suffered damage, but the British had failed to break through. De Grasse held his line, and more importantly, the mouth of the bay. When the British retreated north, they left Cornwallis stranded. By mid-September, Washington and Rochambeau's combined armies had crossed the James River and joined forces with Lafayette and de Saint-Simon's troops. For the first time, the full weight of French and American power stood united on one battlefield. The march had succeeded. The trap was closing. Cornwallis, confident in his position at Yorktown, now found himself surrounded. To the north and west, Washington's army pressed closer by the day. To the east and south, De Grasse's fleet cut off all hope of escape. His letters to General Clinton in New York grew desperate. "I am hemmed in," he wrote, "and must endeavor to hold out until relief arrives." But that relief would never come. Washington arrived at Williamsburg on September 14th, where he met De Grasse in person for the first time. The admiral greeted him aboard his flagship, Ville de Paris, offering his hand and his ships for the final blow. Washington, ever composed, simply said, "Sir, you have rendered great service to America." And so, in the golden light of an early autumn evening, preparations began for the siege that would decide the fate of an empire. Tents rose like a city of canvas across the fields of Virginia. French artillery rolled into place with mathematical precision. American engineers dug trenches by moonlight, their shovels whispering in the soft earth. Every man knew what was at stake. They had come hundreds of miles for this moment, through hunger, storms, and years of doubt. The end was near, but it would not come easily. Cornwallis's redcoats were skilled, disciplined, and desperate. As the sun sank behind the trees, the soldiers lit their campfires. The river gleamed faintly in the dusk. Somewhere beyond the darkness, the British guns waited, silent for now. Washington walked among his men, offering a quiet word here, a nod there. Rochambeau conferred with his officers beneath a flickering lantern. De Grasse's ships floated motionless in the bay, their lanterns glimmering like stars. In that still night, before the storm, all the noise of years, the anger, the politics, the uncertainty, seemed to fade away. Ahead lay the siege of Yorktown. Ahead lay the moment France had long dreamed of, the the chance to avenge its old defeat and to shape the birth of a new nation. And in that quiet, humid Virginia air, as campfires glowed across the fields, history waited to turn its page. The air in Virginia was heavy with anticipation. By early October 1781, the combined French and American forces, nearly 17,000 men, had surrounded the British stronghold at Yorktown. Inside, General Charles Cornwallis commanded about 8,000 troops, backed against the York River, awaiting a rescue fleet that would never come. The British had chosen Yorktown for its deep water port and defensive position, but it had become a trap. De Grasse's French navy controlled the Chesapeake, sealing off every escape route. To the west, Washington and Rochambeau's armies tightened their grip, methodically positioning their siege lines. The grand gamble had succeeded. The lion was cornered. The siege began quietly. In the humid stillness of early October, engineers and soldiers labored through the night, shoveling dirt and driving stakes. They built trenches, redoubts, and gun emplacements in careful silence, often just a few hundred yards from British lines. Every foot of progress meant crawling through mud and sand under the threat of enemy fire. On October 6th, Washington gave the order to begin the first parallel, a continuous trench line stretching nearly 2,000 yards. The night was moonless. Thousands of men moved like shadows through the fields, carrying pickaxes, shovels, and fascines, bundles of sticks used to strengthen earthworks. The sound of digging was the only noise, a slow rhythmic pulse beneath the distant rumble of waves. By dawn, the first parallel was complete. The Americans and French now had a fortified line from which they could bombard Yorktown. Within days, heavy artillery rolled into position, massive 24-pounder cannons and French mortars, hauled through the mud by sweating teams of men and horses. The French artillery officers, trained in the precise science of siege warfare, oversaw every placement with meticulous care. On October 9th, as the sun climbed over the trees, Washington personally fired the first gun. It was a symbolic gesture, but one that echoed through history. The cannonball arced through the morning air and landed squarely inside the British lines. A cheer went up from the trenches. The siege had truly begun. From that moment, the bombardment never stopped. Day and night, the combined artillery pounded Yorktown. The earth shook as hundreds of cannonballs tore through British defences, smashing walls, burning tents, and scattering soldiers. The sound was constant. Deep, rolling thunder mixed with the crack of musket fire and the whine of flying iron. Inside the British camp, there was no escape. Men dug crude shelters, sleeping in trenches filled with rainwater. Horses lay dead in the streets. Ammunition was running low, and rations were spoiled. Cornwallis wrote despairingly to General Clinton in New York. "My situation is critical, and without speedy relief, we must be compelled to submit." Meanwhile, Washington and Rochambeau pressed the advantage. They ordered construction of the second parallel, closer to British lines, just 300 yards from enemy redoubts. It was dangerous work. Each night, men crept forward under cover of darkness, digging feverishly while musket fire whistled overhead. Torches flickered, revealing faces covered in sweat and dust. To secure the second line, two key British positions, Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10, had to fall. These small earthen fortresses anchored the British outer defences. Until they were captured, the Allies couldn't move closer. The assault was planned for the night of October 14th. The French would attack Redoubt 9. The Americans, under the Marquis de Lafayette, would storm Redoubt 10. It was one of the rare moments in the war when French and American forces would fight side by side, under the same sky, for the same purpose. Washington watched from a forward position as the attacks began. The night was dark, the air still. Around 400 American soldiers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton, crept toward Redoubt 10. Bayonets fixed, muskets unloaded. There would be no gunfire to give them away. Then, with a sudden shout, they surged forward. The British, startled and outnumbered, fired desperately, but the Americans were already upon them. Bayonets flashed, shovels turned into weapons, and in less than 10 minutes, the redoubt was theirs. Hamilton's men raised their flag as cheers erupted from the trenches. To the north, the French stormed Redoubt 9 with equal courage. The fighting was brutal, hand to hand in the darkness, but by dawn, both positions had fallen. The Allied lines now encircled Yorktown completely. From his headquarters, Cornwallis watched helplessly as French and American artillery rolled closer, their guns thundering day and night. He ordered counter-battery fire, but his cannons were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. His men were exhausted, their morale collapsing. On October 16th, desperate for escape, Cornwallis attempted one final gamble. Under cover of night, he began ferrying his troops across the York River in small boats, hoping to break through the French lines on the opposite shore. But a violent storm swept in, scattering his boats and forcing him to abandon the attempt. The river itself seemed to betray him. By morning, it was over. His trenches were collapsing, his artillery was silent, and the Allied guns, hundreds of them, continued their relentless, methodical pounding. On October 17th, a white flag appeared over the British lines. A drummer boy led an officer forward, blindfolded, carrying a letter to Washington. It was a request for a ceasefire. After 2 days of negotiation, the terms were set. On October 19th, 1781, General Charles Cornwallis formally surrendered to George Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau. The ceremony was somber, almost quiet. The British troops, neat in their red coats, marched between two lines of Allied soldiers, French on one side, Americans on the other, and laid down their weapons. The drums beat a slow, steady rhythm, echoing over the fields where they had fought and bled. Cornwallis himself claimed illness and did not attend, sending his second-in-command, General O'Hara, in his place. When O'Hara tried to surrender to Rochambeau, the French general pointed to Washington. Washington, in turn, gestured to General Benjamin Lincoln, who had himself been forced to surrender to the British 2 years earlier. The symbolism was deliberate and quietly satisfying. As the ceremony ended, the band played a tune that would echo through history. The world turned upside down. For France, the moment was monumental. 18 years after losing its colonies in North America, it had finally seen Britain humbled on the same soil. French officers embraced one another, tears mixing with laughter and disbelief. Washington, ever reserved, wrote simply in his diary, "This event will have a great effect on the politics of Europe." He was right. Yorktown did not end the war immediately, but it ended Britain's will to fight. In London, when news of the surrender reached Parliament, a stunned silence filled the chamber. Lord North, the Prime Minister, reportedly gasped, "Oh God, it is all over." For the French soldiers, the victory was bittersweet. They had fought and bled for the freedom of another nation, and they knew that their own monarchy was already staggering under the weight of debt. Still, for that brief moment in October 1781, they stood as victors, brothers in arms beside the Americans. As night fell over the smouldering ruins of Yorktown, the campfires glowed once more across the hills. Men sang softly, toasted with borrowed wine, and for the first time in years, slept without fear of battle. But for France, this triumph was only half the story. The war was not yet finished, and the cost of victory was only beginning to show. The surrender at Yorktown felt final, almost divine in its precision. The guns had fallen silent, the banners furled, and the world seemed to exhale. Yet for all its symbolism, Yorktown was not the end. Wars, as history teaches us, do not end with a single surrender. They end with exhaustion, negotiation, and the slow grind of politics. In the winter that followed, the soldiers of both nations waited. The British still held New York, Charleston, and Savannah. Across the Atlantic, the Royal Navy remained vast and formidable. France, though jubilant, knew that the war stretched far beyond the American coastlines, to the Caribbean, to India, to the very trade routes that fed empires. And so, after Yorktown, the fighting continued. In the Caribbean, where sugar was wealth itself, the French and British navies clashed with brutal regularity. Admiral de Grasse, fresh from his triumph at Chesapeake Bay, sailed south with high expectations and heavy pressure from Versailles. France wanted to strike one more blow, to claim more than honour before peace arrived. The target was Jamaica, Britain's richest colony, the jewel of its Atlantic empire. A successful invasion there would cripple British finances and secure French dominance in the Caribbean. But Britain too had learned from defeat. In April 1782, the two navies met off the coast of Dominica in the Battle of the Sainte. The sea was calm, the air clear, the stakes enormous. Admiral de Grasse commanded 33 ships of the line. His British opponent, Admiral George Rodney, had 36. The battle raged for hours. Cannon smoke hung thick across the turquoise water, the thunder of broadsides rolling like endless surf. But this time, the French were outmaneuvered. Rodney, using a daring tactic called breaking the line, cut through the French formation and shattered their cohesion. De Grasse's flagship, Ville de Paris, the same vessel that had carried him to victory at Yorktown, was surrounded. Its decks were splintered, its masts shattered, its guns silenced. When he finally struck his colours, 400 of his crew lay dead or wounded. The loss at the Sainte stunned France. It was the mirror image of Yorktown, a reminder that even the most brilliant victories could be followed by sudden reversals. In Versailles, the ministers of King Louis XVI tried to mask their frustration. The American alliance had cost France dearly. Its navy was strained, its treasury was bleeding, and its people were growing restless under new taxes. Still, pride forbade retreat. The war limped onward. In India, French and British forces fought desperate skirmishes near Madras and Cuddalore. In Europe, Spain, France's ally, besieged Gibraltar, bombarding the rock with enormous floating batteries that were supposed to be unsinkable. The British simply set them ablaze with red-hot cannonballs. The siege failed spectacularly, burning for days and lighting up the Mediterranean night. Everywhere, the pattern was the same. Small triumphs, followed by larger disappointments. By 1782, even Britain, bloodied and bankrupt, was beginning to reconsider. The war had become a drain with no visible end. Public opinion turned bitter, merchants clamoured for peace, and Parliament fell into arguments over who was to blame. Lord North, the man who had led Britain into the war, finally resigned. Across the Atlantic, George Washington watched and waited. He refused to disband his army, fearing the British might yet try to reclaim their lost colonies. His troops, ragged and unpaid, camped uneasily along the Hudson River, living on promises and meagre rations. Meanwhile, diplomats met in secret rooms in Paris, where the real war, the war of words and compromise, was about to begin. There, under candlelight and the distant echo of carriage wheels, representatives from America, France, Spain, and Britain began to shape the peace. Benjamin Franklin, now 76 and as wry as ever, represented the United States alongside John Adams and John Jay. The French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, hoped to use the talks to strengthen France's position and weaken Britain's global reach. But as negotiations unfolded, it became clear that each ally had its own agenda. France wanted to contain Britain, Spain wanted Gibraltar, America wanted independence and land as far west as possible. Franklin, ever pragmatic, realized something early. The Americans could get a better deal if they negotiated directly with Britain rather than through France. Despite the alliance, distrust lingered beneath the surface. France had entered the war to weaken Britain, not necessarily to create a new power across the Atlantic. And so, in the late months of 1782, American and British diplomats quietly met in secret. By November, they had agreed on preliminary terms. Britain would recognize American independence, grant generous western boundaries, and withdraw its troops. The news reached Versailles like a cold wind. Vergennes was polite, but his letter to Franklin was thinly veiled with irritation. "You are afraid of being taken in by us," he wrote, "and we are afraid of being taken in by you." It was a fragile peace, but peace nonetheless. The formal signing came on September 3, 1783, at the Hôtel d'York in Paris. The document was simple, almost plain. The Treaty of Paris. The United States was officially born. France and Spain signed their own treaties with Britain that same day. France gained Tobago and Senegal and minor fishing rights off Newfoundland, but not much else. The grand dreams of reclaiming Canada or conquering Jamaica had vanished. For all its effort and sacrifice, France's tangible gains were small. But the symbolic victory was enormous. Britain's empire had been humbled, and the old humiliation of 1763, when France had lost nearly everything, had been avenged, at least in pride. Yet beneath the celebrations, cracks were forming. France had spent over 1.3 billion livres on the war, an astronomical sum. The navy had to be rebuilt, the army re-equipped, and the treasury replenished. The crown borrowed money it could never repay. The peasants paid the taxes. In the quiet of the palace at Versailles, Louis XVI's ministers counted the cost. They had struck down Britain's dominance, but in doing so, they had sown the seeds of their own undoing. Still, for the men who had fought, on both sides of the Atlantic, the war's end brought a strange silence. In New York, the last British soldiers boarded their ships in November 1783, their red coats fading into the grey mist of the harbour. George Washington stood on the shore, watching in silence. Not far away, a French flag fluttered in the wind, soon to be taken down for the last time. In Paris, Franklin attended a modest dinner with his French hosts. He toasted the friendship between nations, smiled, and said simply, "There never was a good war, nor a bad peace." And in the Caribbean, sailors gazed out at calm seas that had, for nearly a decade, been filled with smoke and fire. The wind smelled of salt, tar, and something else. Relief. The war was over. The world had changed. But the cost, as France would soon discover, was only beginning to unfold. Because sometimes, the greatest danger of victory is what comes after it. When the guns finally fell silent in 1783, France stood among the victors. The banners that had flown over Yorktown, the thunder of de Grasse's cannons, and the cheers of Lafayette's soldiers, all seemed to confirm that the kingdom of Louis XVI had redeemed itself. The humiliation of 1763, that bitter scar from the 7 Years' War, had been avenged. Britain's empire had bent, if not broken, but victory, like wealth, can be deceptive. Beneath the gold and applause, France was quietly crumbling. In the great halls of Versailles, courtiers toasted the end of the war with champagne and laughter. Ministers congratulated one another on the restoration of national honour. Yet behind the polished words and silk curtains, clerks in dim offices were tallying the cost. Columns of numbers so vast they almost defied belief. The war had drained France's treasury to the bone. Louis XVI's government had spent more than 1.3 billion livres, an astronomical sum even by the standards of empire. France's navy alone had consumed nearly half of that total. Hundreds of ships built, armed, and lost. In today's terms, it was the kind of expense that could ruin a nation for a generation. And ruin was exactly what it did. The taxes that supported the monarchy had already been stretched thin. The tile, vingtième, and countless local levies pressed hardest on peasants and the working poor, while the nobility and clergy, protected by privilege, contributed little. Every cartload of grain, every candle sold, every loaf of bread was burdened with royal dues, and yet even as new taxes were proposed, the money never seemed enough. Finance Minister Jacques Necker had once warned Louis XVI that the state's revenues could not sustain another war, but Necker was long gone by 1783, replaced by Charles-Alexandre de Calonne, a man of brilliance and optimism, perhaps too much of both. Calonne surveyed the wreckage and concluded what few dared to say aloud. France was bankrupt in everything but appearance. Yet appearances mattered deeply in Versailles. The king, soft-spoken and well-meaning, believed his realm could recover through reform. Calonne promised him as much. He proposed loans, luxury tariffs, and new schemes to attract investment. For a brief moment, the illusion held. Paris glittered, trade revived, and the court resumed its endless dances and hunts. But underneath, the foundation was rotting. What the war had also changed, quietly, invisibly, was the spirit of the people. For years, soldiers and sailors had fought shoulder to shoulder with men who spoke of liberté. In America, they had seen a new kind of society emerging, one that questioned kings and aristocrats alike. Lafayette, the young nobleman who had become a hero at Yorktown, returned to France full of ideas that made courtiers uncomfortable. He wrote letters to Washington and Franklin, spoke openly of constitutional reforms, and dreamed, naively perhaps, of liberty within monarchy. Even among ordinary people, whispers began to spread. In taverns and workshops, men spoke of les Américains, the people who had fought a king and won. In cities, pamphlets circulated describing the birth of the United States, its assemblies and declarations. These were not revolutionary manifestos yet, but the soil was being prepared. Meanwhile, the very people who had paid for the war, the peasants, the artisans, the small merchants, were slipping deeper into misery. The harvests of 1783 and 1785 were poor, grain prices rose, and bread grew scarce. In Paris, bakers' windows were guarded by soldiers to prevent riots. Mothers lined up before dawn to buy loaves that cost half a day's wages. Yet in Versailles, the parties never stopped. Marie Antoinette, still in her 20s, withdrew increasingly from court politics into her own world of leisure. At her private retreat, the Petit Trianon, she hosted small gatherings where courtiers dressed as shepherds and shepherdesses, playing at simplicity among marble fountains. To the suffering peasants, such scenes became symbols of mockery, a queen pretending to be poor while her subjects starved. Calonne, aware that the kingdom teetered on the edge, tried one last gamble. In 1786, he presented to Louis XVI an audacious plan of reform: abolish the exemptions of the nobility, tax all landowners equally, and modernize the financial system. It was radical, even reasonable, but it was also doomed. The aristocracy, those same families who had cheered France's glory at Yorktown, refused. They would not give up their privileges, even to save the nation that had bought their victories. The court turned against Calonne, whispering that he was reckless, even dangerous. By 1787, he was dismissed and fled to England, a cruel irony, since it was England's defeat that had begun the spiral. In his place came Loménie de Brienne, a churchman turned reformer, who soon discovered what every finance minister in France would eventually learn. It was not the arithmetic that was impossible, but the politics. Every attempt at reform ended in protest, every protest in paralysis. And all the while, the debt deepened. Letters from provincial officials painted the same bleak picture. Parishes unable to collect taxes, soldiers unpaid, warehouses empty of grain. The crown borrowed more and more, at higher and higher interest. Bankers in Amsterdam and Geneva began to hesitate. By 1787, France could no longer borrow at reasonable rates. The monarchy, once Europe's model of splendor, had become a debtor pleading for credit. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the young United States struggled with its own experiments in liberty. American trade with France was limited, its economy fragile. The alliance that had once seemed so noble now faded into polite distance. Franklin, now old and frail, returned to America in 1785. Lafayette stayed in correspondence. But the two nations that had once shared victory were now drifting apart, each preoccupied with its own troubles. Back in France, the public mood darkened. Pamphlets denounced corruption, newspapers mocked the court, and coffee houses buzzed with political gossip. The words rights, representation, and reason began to appear more often in conversation, words that would soon take on a force stronger than any cannon. In those years, between 1783 and 1787, France was like a ship gliding smoothly on calm seas, its sails still bright from victory. But below deck, the hull was splitting plank by plank. Few at Versailles noticed. Those who did could not agree on how to repair it. And so, while the nobility danced and the clergy preached patience, and the king hesitated. The quiet murmurs of discontent spread from town to town, field to field. The glory of Yorktown had come at a price too large to count. France had regained its honor, yes, but honor could not pay debts, nor feed its people. And as the kingdom drifted into the uncertain years ahead, one question lingered, unasked, but inescapable. What happens to a nation when its greatest victory becomes the seed of its greatest fall? By 1787, the bright banners of France's American glory were fading into memory. The stories of Yorktown and de Grasse's fleet still appeared in newspapers and salons, but now they seemed like echoes from another world, one where France was confident, united, and strong. That world no longer existed. The debts of victory had come due. The gold had run dry. The old rhythms of monarchy, the borrowing, the banquets, the polite assurances of reform, had all lost their rhythm. France was still rich in culture, land, and people, but its system of power, built on privilege and centuries of habit, was quietly collapsing under its own weight. In 1787, Louis XVI took a desperate step. He summoned what was called the Assembly of Notables, a gathering of the kingdom's most powerful nobles, clergy, and magistrates, men of birth and influence, chosen to approve a plan that might save France from ruin. The king and his minister, Loménie de Brienne, hoped the notables would agree to a sweeping reform, taxation for all, regardless of status. It was bold, even reasonable. But when the assembly met in the chilly halls of Versailles, it was not reason that filled the air, it was pride. The notables refused. They argued that only a body representing all of France could consent to such taxes. They were not wrong, but their motives were not entirely pure. Many hoped to delay, to protect their own privileges, to avoid responsibility. Still, the suggestion that France needed broader representation, that the people themselves should have a voice, did not vanish. It grew, quietly, like a spark under dry leaves. Across the kingdom, pamphlets and letters debated what a national assembly might look like. Provincial administrators sent warnings to Paris. The people speak of America, they speak of liberty. Soldiers who had once served in the American War recalled what they had seen: assemblies, elections, constitutions. Even peasants, though far from politics, began to mutter in new ways. The burden of taxes grew heavier, the cost of bread climbed, and winters bit harder. The harvest of 1788 was disastrous. Rains destroyed the grain, frost blackened the fields, and famine crept across the countryside. In some provinces, villagers tore down toll gates and grain storehouses. Others gathered in parish churches to petition the crown for relief. But the crown, drowning in debt, had little to give. By the spring of 1788, France was trembling, not from rebellion yet, but from exhaustion. That year, Brienne tried to bypass the nobility and impose reforms by royal decree. The reaction was immediate. The Parlement, the regional high courts dominated by nobles, protested that only the Estates General, a body that had not met since 1614, could consent to new taxes. Crowds gathered in Paris and Grenoble, cheering the magistrates who defied the king. The government responded with force. Troops entered Grenoble to suppress protests, but the townspeople fought back. Roof tiles rained down on the soldiers from windows above. The event became known as the Day of the Tiles. A strange, almost comic scene, but one that signaled something deeper. The people were no longer afraid to resist. Meanwhile, in Paris, the talk of reform was turning into talk of principle. Writers like Abbé Sieyès and the young Mirabeau began to circulate pamphlets asking dangerous questions. "What is the Third Estate?" Sieyès asked. "Everything. What has it been until now? Nothing. What does it want to be? Something." It was a simple question, yet one that captured the growing sense that the nation itself, the farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and lawyers, was awakening from a long slumber. At court, Louis XVI hesitated. He was not a cruel man, nor blind to his people's suffering, but he was trapped by the weight of his position and the timidity of tradition. Each reform he approved was met with protest. Each compromise made him appear weaker. The monarchy's authority, once absolute, was now fraying at its edges. In the salons of Paris, talk of America returned, but now as prophecy, not pride. If the Americans had overthrown tyranny and built a republic, why not France? Of course, few imagined a kingless France yet. Even the most radical thinkers spoke only of balance, not revolution. But the words themselves, rights, equality, representation, were breaking through centuries of silence. By late 1788, Brienne had failed, just as Calonne had before him. The treasury was empty once again, and no one would lend to the crown. Faced with collapse, the king did what no monarch had done in nearly 2 centuries. He agreed to summon the Estates General. It was a moment of both hope and dread. Hope, because it promised renewal, a chance for the nation to speak, to find a path forward. Dread, because no one quite knew what would happen when the 3 orders of France, the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners, met in the same hall, with so much anger waiting just below the surface. The winter of 1788-1789 was among the coldest in living memory. Rivers froze solid. Paris shivered. Bread was scarce and expensive. In some places, bakers had to guard their ovens with soldiers. Yet amid this suffering, something extraordinary began to happen. Across the country, the Crown ordered local communities to elect delegates and draft cahiers de doléances, notebooks of grievances, to send to Versailles. For the first time in generations, millions of ordinary French men, and in some cases, women through their parishes, put their thoughts to paper. They wrote of taxes, corruption, famine, and injustice. They wrote of the price of salt, of feudal dues, of landlords who charged for grinding grain and baking bread. But they also wrote of ideas, of liberty, equality, and the rights of man. Many had never read Rousseau or Montesquieu, but they had heard the words from those who had. By early 1789, wagons filled with petitions and letters rolled toward Paris. Delegates packed their trunks and set off for Versailles. Lawyers, priests, merchants, farmers, and a scattering of noblemen who sympathized with reform. Among them was Lafayette, the young hero of the American War, now older and more thoughtful. He still believed that monarchy and liberty could coexist, that France could reform itself without blood. He would soon learn how wrong he was, and as spring warmed the countryside and the roads filled with travelers headed for the King's Great Assembly, few could have guessed how quickly it would all unravel. In just a few months, the nation that had once saved another's revolution would ignite one of its own. And so, as the church bells of May 1789 rang out over Versailles, and delegates stepped into the gilded hall for the first time in centuries, one could almost hear the faint echo of another revolution across the ocean, whispering back. Would France follow the same path as America, or forge something far more radical? The morning of May 5th, 1789, dawned clear and bright over Versailles. The royal palace, that immense symbol of France's glory, stirred with the noise of carriages, trumpets, and murmuring crowds. After 175 years, the Estates General had returned. From across the kingdom, 1,200 deputies gathered, men in black robes, clerical gowns, and embroidered coats trimmed with gold. They represented 3 estates of the realm: the clergy, the nobility, and the Third Estate, the commoners, who outnumbered the others combined. It was meant to be a ceremony of renewal, of loyalty and unity. Yet beneath the polite applause and royal processions, tension crackled like a storm waiting to break. The hall was beautiful, but divided. The nobles and clergy sat apart from the commoners. Each estate would vote separately, just as it had centuries before. This meant that the 2 privileged orders, less than 3% of the population, could always outvote the Third Estate, which represented everyone else. It was an arrangement so absurd, so detached from the reality of a starving nation, that it could not last. In the weeks that followed, the deputies argued over procedures, not policies. Who would vote first? How would votes be counted? Could all 3 estates meet together? The debates were endless and symbolic of something deeper. The struggle over who truly was France. The nobles clung to tradition. The clergy hesitated, divided between rich bishops loyal to the crown and poor parish priests who sympathized with the people. And the Third Estate, led by lawyers and reformers, grew restless. Among them was Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, the quiet priest whose pamphlet, "What is the Third Estate?" had become a revolutionary manifesto. He stood in the assembly and said, "The Third Estate is the nation. Whatever a nation does, it has the right to do for itself." That sentence changed everything. In June, after weeks of stalemate, the deputies of the Third Estate took matters into their own hands. They declared themselves the National Assembly, the true representative body of France. They invited the other estates to join them. The king hesitated. The nobles protested. The doors to their meeting hall were locked. Whether by accident or royal order, no one knew. So the deputies gathered instead in a nearby indoor tennis court, a long, echoing room of wooden floors and painted walls. There, on June 20th, 1789, they swore a collective oath, never to separate until they had given France a constitution. The tennis court oath was simple, almost theatrical, but in that moment, something irreversible began. Power had shifted. From the monarchy, from privilege, from the old world, to the people themselves. When the king finally gave way and ordered the clergy and nobility to join the new assembly, it was too late. The authority of Versailles was already eroding. And then, less than a month later, the first shots were fired. On July 14th, 1789, Paris exploded. Crowds, hungry and afraid, stormed the Bastille, an old fortress prison that stood as a symbol of royal tyranny. There were few prisoners inside, but that hardly mattered. What mattered was the act, the tearing down of the king's fortress, brick by brick, by the hands of his own subjects. The fall of the Bastille sent shockwaves through France. In towns and villages, peasants rose against landlords, burning records of feudal dues. Aristocrats fled abroad. The countryside burned with panic and hope. The king, bewildered, asked his advisor, "Is it a revolt?" "No, sire," came the reply. "It is a revolution." By August, the National Assembly moved to calm the chaos by doing something unthinkable. It abolished feudalism. Overnight, centuries of privilege were erased. Taxes, tithes, and hereditary rights vanished into law books. Then, on August 26th, came a declaration that echoed across the world. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. All men are born and remain free and equal in rights, it proclaimed. Government, it said, existed to protect liberty, property, and security. Sovereignty lay not in the king, but in the nation. The ideas were dazzling, yet they were also dangerous, for they questioned the very structure of authority, not only in France, but everywhere. In the months that followed, Paris became the center of a growing storm. Food remained scarce. Bread riots flared again. In October 1789, a crowd of women, market women, mothers, and fishmongers marched from Paris to Versailles, shouting for bread and justice. They surrounded the palace, forcing Louis XVI to appear before them. By morning, the royal family agreed to return to Paris, escorted by the cheering, jeering crowd. The king was no longer a ruler above his people. He was a prisoner among them. The National Assembly followed him to the capital, settling in a former riding school near the Tuileries Palace. There, amid constant noise and rumour, they began to draft a constitution. It was a strange new age, one of debates, pamphlets, and restless hope. The air of Paris itself seemed charged with words: liberty, equality, fraternity. The same streets that once whispered of famine now echoed with argument and song. Yet, for all its excitement, the revolution was uncertain. The king signed decrees reluctantly. The clergy were divided by the civil constitution of the clergy, which made priests servants of the state. The nobles who remained felt cornered and betrayed. And outside France, Europe watched with unease. Monarchs saw the events in Paris not as progress, but as contagion. In London, Berlin, and Vienna, ministers whispered that France was tearing itself apart. They were not wrong. By 1791, the revolution had entered a dangerous balance, half dream, half nightmare. The constitution was nearly complete, and France would become a constitutional monarchy. But trust between king and people was gone. That summer, Louis XVI tried to flee. Disguised in plain clothes, he and his family slipped out of Paris by carriage, hoping to reach the fortress town of Montmédy near the border. But at the small village of Varennes, they were recognized, arrested, and brought back to the capital in silence. The escape shattered the last illusions. The people no longer saw their king as a partner in reform, but as a traitor to the revolution. As the carriage rolled back into Paris, a terrible quiet fell. Crowds lined the streets, not shouting, not celebrating, just watching, expressionless. It was the stillness before something vast and violent. By the autumn of 1791, the new constitution was signed. France was now a constitutional monarchy in name. The National Assembly dissolved, replaced by the Legislative Assembly. New factions rose, the Feuillants, the Girondins, the Jacobins, each claiming to represent the people, each suspicious of the others. And somewhere, deep beneath it all, the old question returned, now sharper than ever. Could liberty survive in a land where hunger still ruled? Could a revolution of words endure against the weight of fear? The winds were shifting once again, and beyond France's borders, kings were beginning to sharpen their swords. The age of war and terror was about to begin. By the end of 1791, the French Revolution had changed everything, and yet, for many, nothing at all. Bread was still scarce, taxes were still heavy. The king still wore his crown, though now by permission rather than by divine right. France had a constitution, but it was fragile, built on compromise and mistrust. In theory, Louis XVI ruled as a constitutional monarch. In reality, he ruled nothing. Every decree required the Assembly's consent. Every gesture was suspect. The people had learned to cheer for the nation, not the king. And the king, humiliated and trapped, had learned to smile for survival. But the world beyond France was watching. In Vienna and Berlin, the monarchs of Europe saw the revolution not as reform, but as infection. The sight of a king confined by his subjects terrified them. Nobles who had fled France, émigrés, filled foreign courts with stories of chaos, mobs, and sacrilege. In April 1792, France, now under the Legislative Assembly, declared war on Austria. The call to arms was meant to defend the revolution, but it was also a gamble. The Girondins, the revolutionary faction in power, believed war would unite the nation and spread liberty across Europe. Instead, it exposed the revolution's weakness. France's army was in disarray. Officers had fled, discipline had collapsed, and supply lines barely functioned. Many soldiers were volunteers, full of zeal, but with little training. When the war began, they marched singing La Marseillaise, a song of defiance that would one day become the nation's anthem. But their enthusiasm could not stop defeat. In the spring and summer of 1792, Austrian and Prussian troops pushed into French territory. Towns fell. Panic spread. Rumors of treason filled the streets of Paris. People whispered that the king was secretly aiding the enemy, that the court hoped for a foreign rescue. By July, those whispers had become conviction. Then came the Brunswick Manifesto, a declaration by the Duke of Brunswick, commander of the invading armies, warning that if any harm came to the royal family, Paris would be destroyed. Instead of intimidating the revolutionaries, it enraged them. On August 10th, 1792, the storm broke. Thousands of armed Parisians, joined by militant sans-culottes and National Guardsmen, marched on the Tuileries Palace, where the royal family was housed. The king's Swiss guards tried to defend the gates, but they were overwhelmed in hours. Blood ran across the cobblestones, the air filled with smoke and cries. The monarchy had fallen. The royal family sought refuge in the assembly, which, under pressure from the mob, suspended the king's authority and declared France a republic in all but name. In the following weeks, power shifted again. A new revolutionary body, the National Convention, was elected to draft a republican constitution. Its members were divided between factions: the Girondins, who wanted a constitutional republic, and the Jacobins, led by Robespierre, who believed the revolution must purge itself of all enemies. Meanwhile, outside the city, the war worsened. The Prussians advanced toward Paris. Refugees poured in. Fear and anger fused into something darker. In early September, as foreign armies approached and rumors of counter-revolution spread, Paris erupted in a wave of violence. Revolutionary mobs stormed the prisons, claiming they held traitors who would aid the enemy. For days, the killing continued. Priests, nobles, even ordinary prisoners, hundreds were executed in what became known as the September Massacres. It was not justice. It was fear unchained. When news of the massacres reached the provinces, France shuddered. But no one could stop it now. The old world had been torn apart, and no one knew what might grow in its place. In September 1792, the National Convention met for the first time. One of its first acts was to proclaim the abolition of the monarchy. France was now officially a republic. The royal titles were gone. Coins bearing the king's face were melted down. Church bells were recast into canon. In a symbolic act, the calendar itself was rewritten. Years would now be counted from the birth of the republic, not from the reign of kings. But the king himself still lived, a prisoner in the Temple Tower with his wife, Marie Antoinette, and their children. What to do with him became the convention's most bitter question. Some argued for mercy, others for exile. But the Jacobins, led by Robespierre and Saint-Just, insisted that the revolution could not live while the symbol of tyranny still breathed. In December 1792, Louis XVI was brought to trial. The proceedings were solemn, almost theatrical. The charges were read: treason against the nation, conspiracy with foreign powers, the shedding of French blood. Louis listened calmly. When asked for his defense, he replied, "I forgive those who accuse me. I have acted for the good of my people." But the verdict was already decided. On January 20th, 1793, the convention voted. The margin was narrow, but it was enough. By a vote of 361 to 360, the sentence was death. The next morning, under a pale winter sky, Louis XVI was led to the scaffold in the Place de la Révolution. The crowd was silent as he mounted the steps. He tried to speak, but a drum roll drowned his words. The blade fell swiftly. France gasped, and then, in terrible unity, it cheered. The king was dead. The republic was born in blood. But even as the people celebrated, a new fear began to rise. Across Europe, kings and emperors recoiled in horror. The execution of Louis XVI made diplomacy impossible. Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands joined Austria and Prussia in war. The First Coalition was born, a united front to crush the revolution before it could spread. And within France, rebellion brewed anew. In the western countryside, peasants rose in defense of church and king, sparking the war in the Vendée. The revolution, which had promised liberty, was now surrounded by enemies, foreign and domestic. Paris, exhausted and hungry, braced itself. The guillotine would not rest. And as the year 1793 dawned, the revolution that had once sought freedom now faced its most dangerous test: how to survive its own victory. Because revolutions, like wars, often devour their children. The blade that fell on Louis XVI did not end the revolution. It only began a new and darker chapter. By early 1793, the French Republic stood alone against nearly all of Europe. Britain, Austria, Prussia, Spain, the Dutch Republic, all had declared war. Inside France, royalist uprisings flared across the countryside, and in the western region of the Vendée, peasants took up arms under white flags embroidered with the fleur-de-lis. The revolution was surrounded by enemies and bleeding from within. The National Convention, in desperation, turned to extraordinary measures. It created a new executive body, the Committee of Public Safety, to defend the revolution by any means necessary. At its head soon stood a man of quiet voice and absolute conviction, Maximilien Robespierre. He was not a soldier or nobleman, not even an orator in the grand sense. He was a lawyer, precise, unbending, incorruptible, or so he believed. To his followers, he embodied the purity of the Republic. To his enemies, he became its ghostly executioner. Meanwhile, France's armies were faltering. The war effort was chaotic. Generals defected or were arrested for incompetence. Supplies were short, and food riots erupted in Paris. The revolution had promised liberty and bread. Now it seemed to offer neither. In March 1793, the Convention declared the levée en masse, a national conscription of every able-bodied man to defend the Republic. Farmers left their fields, blacksmiths their forges, students their schools. France, for the first time, became a nation at war in the modern sense, its survival tied to the will of its people. That same spring, the guillotine grew busier. The Revolutionary Tribunal was created to try enemies of the Republic. Aristocrats, priests, merchants, even former revolutionaries whose loyalty seemed uncertain. Accusation became as fatal as guilt, and yet, amid the blood and the fear, there were moments of triumph. In the summer of 1793, a young artillery officer from Corsica, named Napoleon Bonaparte, distinguished himself at Toulon, where the British and Royalists held the port. His skill with cannon helped reclaim the city for the Republic. Few noticed him then, but history would remember. Still, victory brought little relief. Paris itself was turning inward, devouring its own revolutionaries. Factions that had once stood shoulder to shoulder now turned on one another. The Girondins, the moderate Republicans, were accused of treason and purged from the Convention. Many were arrested, others fled. Some went to the guillotine, their speeches drowned by the drums of the square. By the autumn of 1793, the revolution's language had changed. Liberty had been replaced by virtue, and virtue, according to Robespierre, could only be preserved through terror. The basis of popular government in revolution, he declared, is virtue combined with terror. Without virtue, terror is disastrous. Without terror, virtue is powerless. And so, terror became law. The law of suspects allowed for the arrest of anyone who, by their conduct or relationships, have shown themselves enemies of liberty. It was vague by design and vast in its reach. Neighbours informed on neighbours. Families whispered in fear. In the Place de la Révolution, the guillotine worked without rest. Nobles, soldiers, priests and peasants all met the same fate. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, followed her husband to the scaffold in October 1793. Her last words, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to do it," were spoken to the executioner after she accidentally stepped on his foot. Even the calendar was remade. Sundays were abolished. Months were renamed after the seasons: Brumaire, Thermidor, Vendémiaire. The year 1793 became year 2 of the Republic, the year of virtue and fear. And yet, paradoxically, France began to win. The levée en masse had flooded the armies with soldiers. French troops, once disorganized, were now fierce with conviction. At Valmy and Fleurus, they turned back the coalition forces. The revolution, it seemed, might actually survive. But its guardians were not content with survival. They sought purity. The Committee of Public Safety turned against anyone who questioned its authority. Danton, once a hero of the people, was arrested and executed for indulgence. Desmoulins, his friend and fellow revolutionary, followed him, pleading for mercy to the very end. Robespierre, more isolated than ever, began to see traitors everywhere. His speeches grew stranger, almost mystical. He spoke of the supreme being, of virtue, and of destiny. The Convention applauded, but uneasily. By the summer of 1794, even his allies began to whisper that the revolution was devouring itself. On 9th of Thermidor, year the 2nd, July 27th, 1794, Robespierre rose to speak before the convention. He hinted that new traitors were among them, but refused to name names. Fear spread instantly. By nightfall, the convention turned on him. The very men who once cheered his purity now saw their own deaths in his words. He was arrested, along with Saint-Just and his closest supporters. The next day, Robespierre was led to the same guillotine he had defended. His jaw shattered by a bullet, he could not speak. The crowd, once silent at the death of kings, now shouted with relief. The blade fell, and with it, the terror ended. Or perhaps it simply changed its name. When the executions stopped, France was not free, but exhausted. The revolution had consumed nobles, priests, and commoners alike. Hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced. The Republic had survived, but at an unthinkable cost. Yet even in its ruin, something profound had shifted. For the first time, a European people had declared that sovereignty belonged not to kings or gods, but to themselves. Ideas once whispered in the salons of Paris and the huts of peasants had now become the foundation of a new world. In America, across the ocean, news of Robespierre's fall was met with uneasy admiration. The revolution that France had once helped to birth had, in a way, come home again. More violent, more radical, more human. The soldiers who fought under the tricolour banner carried that idea with them, across Europe and beyond. Among them was Napoleon Bonaparte, now a rising star in the army. The Republic had survived its chaos long enough to give birth to an empire. And as the smoke of revolution settled over France, the question lingered, quiet but persistent. Had France avenged its humiliation of 1763? Or had it simply traded one form of bondage for another? The American War had begun as a chance for revenge. It had ended by reshaping the very meaning of liberty. And as you lie here, perhaps hearing the slow ticking of a clock or the soft hum of the night, remember how strange history can be. How easily one war becomes another. How the victories of one generation can become the revolutions of the next. The story of France's almost victory over Britain did not end in America. It ended here, in the quiet after the storm, where the echo of freedom still trembles like a candle's last light against the walls of the old world. So close your eyes. The cannons are silent now. The guillotine stands empty. The revolution sleeps, but its dream continues.